Welcome to you all in Drammen and also Bergen in these two rooms. And I also like to welcome all you following this event on YouTube. And a special warm welcome to our speakers, Tetyana Kalchenko and also Erik Tonsmeyer, which will appear on the screen behind us, and Arne Grønlund, which is sitting here in the front. And also a special welcome to GC Rieber from the Rieber Foundation for making this event possible, and also the entrance for all of you free. We would also like to extend a welcome to Drammen, where you are hosting the first Naturlig Onsdag meeting at Gummibaren next to the beautiful river of Drammen. I hope you're all enjoying yourself there next to the river. The topic of this evening is about the health consequences on an individual level and also on a community level on a more plant-based way of eating. But also seeing how that is correlating with the need when it comes to making well-working climate change mitigations, which is quite interesting because in a way, even if the reason is different, the solution might be quite similar, especially when 7.5 billion people is going to live on this planet. The way we are eating and the way we are living needs to be in sync with our surroundings. There are quite some challenges which has to be addressed, both in the way we eat, our health, and on the climate level. And it will be interesting to see how this meeting is in a way trying to build a bridge between health and climate situations. And this will be especially important when the amount of people on the planet is increasing. Some years ago, I was told by GC Rieber about the China study, which is one of the biggest diet-related studies in China and the US. And one of the writers of this study is called Colin Campbell. He is a professor emeritus of nutrition in biochemistry at the Cornell University. And we will open this evening by listening to him addressing the TedEX talk, Resolving the Health Care Crisis.
I'm here to talk about health. Your health, my health, the health of your families and friends, especially our children. I'm actually here to talk about health, in fact, of our country. But talking about health, thinking about how we can get health, we are in a system today that is not exactly to our liking. I think many of you would probably agree that we have a healthcare crisis. 18% of our gross domestic product is I'm here to talk about health. Your health, my health, the health of your families and friends, especially our children. I'm actually here to talk about health, in fact, of our country. But talking about health, thinking about how we can get health, we are in a system today that is not exactly to our liking. I think many of you would probably agree that we have a healthcare crisis. 18% of our gross domestic product is accounted for by the money we spend for taking care of our health. In this country, the United States has the highest per capita healthcare costs in the world. We're twice as high as the next highest country. But in spite of all this money that's being spent, the quality of our health care, we've got to really face it. The quality of our health care in this country, according to the statistics and health indicators, we place us near last or last among similarly economically developed countries. On top of it, we've got another problem too. We've got more than 50 million people who don't have health insurance. And that's up 40% just in the last decade. This is a fantastic business model, I think you would agree. It really has been. A lot of people are making a lot of money. But as far as health, it's not a good health model. In terms of looking to the future, what's likely to come because of this problem we presently have, if the tripling of childhood obesity during the last decade, or the last 30 years, is any indication, we're not going in the right direction. Especially when we think about, too, the invasion of our children by type 2 diabetes. It used to be called adult onset diabetes. We might as well put the children thing in it, too. Or the 83% increase in a harsh drug like Ritalin in our children during the last 4 years. Something's not quite right. I'm talking about prescription drugs, by the way. At the present time, 9 out of 10 people 60 years of age and older are consuming at least one or more prescription drugs on a regular basis. I'm not one of them, by the way, and I'm more than 60. Neither is my wife taking drugs. Prescription drugs costs, on the other hand, have doubled in the last decade, and that's after we take into consideration adjustment for inflation. And on this particular point, as much as we are using prescription drugs these days, it's sort of the centerpiece of our healthcare system. It turns out it's the number 3 cause of death. Some would say number 4, depending on how you divide up the first 3. But in any case, you don't see this listed in the causes of death in most of the popular reports. Something's missing. Something is missing from our system, and that's really what I want to talk to you about. I'd like to suggest it's nutrition. We don't understand it. It's confusing. And on this question concerning nutrition, let me just do a little defining here, if I may. Nutrition, if we think of it biologically, is actually using food to maintain health and prevent disease. And the typical diet that we now, in my view, believe is the healthiest possible diet is the so-called 80-10-10 diet. Namely, it's the nutrient composition having to do with 80 parts carbohydrate, 10 parts protein, 10 parts fat on the basis of an energy basis. And that translates into a practical message. What I'm talking about now, it's a whole food, plant-based diet with little or no of the 3 devils, oil and fat being one, sugar and salt. That's the diet that really does create optimum health. And on that question concerning nutrient composition, by the way, nutrient composition is the index. It's the characteristic of food that best defines its effect on us in terms of health. And in terms of this nutrient composition question, antioxidants, complex carbohydrates, and vitamins those are the key elements that really give rise to health. They're all found in plants. That's what plants really are. Plants make these things. Animal foods don't make these things. We might see little antioxidants in animals from animal-based foods from time to time, but that has to do with the animals having eaten that kind of thing before they were slaughtered. Fat and protein are essential elements, absolutely essential elements. But it turns out that plants have around 9–11% or so of their, on average. Animal-based foods have quite a bit more. So there's the distinctive difference between animal and plant-based foods. There's another class of foods that's crept into our society too in more recent decades that has to do with processed foods. Processed foods, their nutrient composition is all over the map. It depends on how one combines pieces of the other groups of foods. Processed foods also are not good because they tend to be very high in salt, sugar, and fat, the 3 devils. So I come back to my main point, is whole plant-based foods that really are doing the job for us. Now, when people think about whole plant-based foods, we've known for a good long time, our grandmothers told us, our mothers told us that it prevents future disease. But it's not only about using this diet to prevent future disease, and here is the kicker. Here is the thing that really matters that the public tend not to know. It's also about using this same kind of diet to actually treat existing disease. And I think this is a really important concept. because it goes right to the core of what our healthcare and medical care system is all about. Here's a list of diseases, for example, that one can find in the legitimate scientific literature, in the peer-reviewed literature. Here are diseases that have been documented to be affected by a whole food plant-based diet. That is to say, this kind of diet prevents, suspends, that means stops the further progression, or cures all of these diseases. We can now cure heart disease in fairly late stages. We can cure type 2 diabetes in a very short period of time. I have spent more than 50 years in this field as an experimental researcher, if you will, in the area of nutrition. And I want to share with you a little bit about where I came from and why I think the way I do now. It's controversial for some, but nonetheless, I really believe in the data that we've obtained. Initially, I was involved in investigating nutrients on a one-by-one basis, and still today, that's the way research tends to work. Looking at one thing at a time, just one thing at a time. But over the years, I finally came to the view, and this is really where the punchline is here, this is where the power of nutrition really exists. Nutrition should be recognized as the holistic effect of countless nutrients involving countless diseases, working through countless mechanisms. Now I want to share with you just some, as I look back and sort of ask myself, how did I sort of get to this place? Because I didn't start here in my career some 50 years ago. And I want to share with you just a few observations that were taken from my own research quite a number of years ago now, 35 years ago, that kind of set the stage in a way for developing some principles that apply to what nutrition and health really is all about. This model I'm going to be telling you about in the next 3 or 4 slides here involves a laboratory animal model, laboratory rats in this particular case, that have been genetically programmed to get cancer. And so let's see what do we see. I'm interested in this particular case here to see what effect nutrition might have on that model, where the genes are there to create the disease. When we feed, in this particular case, an animal that has the ideal levels of protein, that being about 20% of total protein, when we feed a diet that is 20% dietary protein, these cancers are growing well in the first 6 weeks in those animals. In contrast, when you feed a diet of 5% dietary protein, they don't, even though they've been genetically programmed to get the disease. This next little bit of this next observation really struck me as being quite significant. Namely, when we watch these sort of cancers growing in the first stage and switch the diet back and forth between 20% protein and 5% protein, you can see it there. We could get to a point where we could turn on and turn off cancer development, which is a very exciting concept. Because it basically says, in this case it's protein, but basically in a more general sense, it shows that nutrition controls cancer development. Very exciting concept. Instead of thinking about genes causing cancer or carcinogens causing cancer or viruses causing cancer, well, I'm talking about here in this particular case, nutrients, nutrition, basically controlling cancer development. Now, it turns out that the protein that we were using, up until a certain point in time, didn't pay a lot of attention to it because it was a protein that was available for us, was casein. Casein is the main protein of cow's milk. Why is that important? Well, soy and wheat protein, for example, does not increase cancer development like does casein. Here's a couple of plant proteins not doing it, one animal protein doing it, a major difference between the two. So it suggested at that particular point in time the hypothesis that maybe animal protein would promote cancer and plant protein would prevent cancer. And that came down as a fairly general statement that I was to carry through much of my research. It turned out that's the bifurcation that really led to this distinctive differences between these two different kinds of foods. Now, as I say, this is a little troubling for me personally at the time because actually I was raised on a dairy farm. There's me up front, maybe I think it's about 9.5 years ago or so. And another just sort of sidebar story here before I go on. I talked about casein, dairy, and so forth. And so we have a lot of evidence now that dairy is a troublesome food, a very troublesome food, not just because of what we found with respect to its ability to increase cancer, but you know, my family, we don't use dairy anymore, haven't in some time. And I suggest if we want to do it right, you know, get with the program. So let's go back then to the model that I was using just to tell you about some of the principles that in fact affected me and my thinking in a larger context as we went forward. Namely, in this particular case, we're looking at just not that 5%, 20% kind of thing, but we're looking at a range of protein concentrations in the food to see what happens. And you can see here that in the lower levels of protein, dietary protein from 4 to 10% in this particular case, it's not the exact amounts I'm really concerned about here, it's the inflection that I want to talk about. But with up to about 10% dietary protein, what you can see is that protein is doing its good thing. It's not creating cancer, it's not promoting cancer. Protein is an essential nutrient, we need it. Everything's working fine. So what I'm talking about here is when we consume it in excess to the amount we need. And in fact, most of us humans actually live in that red zone where we're consuming in excess of what we need. So that 10% is enough, really is enough. And that actually is provided by a diet made up of whole plant-based foods. If we're consuming a diet of whole plant-based foods, we're actually getting the ideal levels of protein. We don't need more. But unfortunately, 95% of us, according to the national statistics, are consuming in excess of what we need, and we do that by actually consuming animal-based foods. Now I want to just take you to just another little idea here coming from these experiments that I found very interesting. Just a little schematic, so just treat it as a schematic. I've just sort of given you 2 clusters of cells. One cluster of the red cells, those are the ones, let's argue, let's propose, they're the genetically programmed cells to give rise to cancer. The seed has been planted. The immunogenic event has occurred, okay? Those are the cells that are programmed to get cancer. The blue cells are normal cells. So on the left, we've got a high dose, let's say a high dose of genetically prone cancer cells. On the right, we've got a far less dose, just a little bit. Now, if all else is considered equal, if nothing else has changed beyond that point, obviously the one with the highest dose of the genetically programmed cancers are going to get more cancer. Fair enough. The ones on the right get less cancer. So in that particular case, it's legitimate to say that genes cause cancer. All diseases really start with genes at some fundamental level. So in this case, we can say genes cause cancer. Sort of makes sense. However, look what happens when we get to that stage. Now, our genes are constant over a lifetime, more or less. But we go beyond the genes. If we look in this particular model here, it turns out that if you take the cells on the left, where there's a very high degree of genetic concentration of the cells, feed them the low protein diets, we get less cancer, not more. In other words, completely just switch it. So what really matters here is not the genes. What's mattering in this particular case is the expression of those genes. That, in turn, is controlled by nutrition. And that is really one of the most fundamental properties of nutrition across the board, not just in this particular model, but in this particular model, it was actually a key. It was a key. It was a lead-in, in fact, to a larger consideration. So nutrition controls cancer genes. It controls genes across the board. It's really quite interesting for all kinds of diseases. And so we can say nutrition trumps genes. That's my view, and we have lots of evidence now to really make that point. It's something we can do about rather than something we can't do anything about. And it turns out there's a list of these same diseases, again, that all basically start with genes controlled by nutrition. So I have a question in the current conversation we're having now. If nutrition controls genes, then why are we spending so much money for genetic research? In my estimation, it's a rough approximation, we're spending at least 100 times the amount of funding for genetic research than we do for nutrition research. When in fact it's nutrition that actually gives us the health. It's not the genes. Genetic research, of course, makes money. Or at least there's the perception of those who are making this money available that in fact it's doing that. Nutrition research only makes health. So it comes down to this. How do we understand nutrition? As I said in the beginning, it's about looking at one nutrient at a time. And we see that every day. The recommended dietary allowance is this nutrient, you need this much, food labeling. It's actually led to a vitamin supplement industry, as a matter of fact. A $30+ billion industry. We now know that nutrient supplements really don't do the job. That's not what we need. I like to say, let's call that an old paradigm. The practice of medicine is the same sort of argument. At the present time, our health system, our medical practice system is reductionist in nature. We think about single causes, single biomarkers. You go to the doctor, it tells you how much cholesterol you have, how much blood sugar, as if these are really things that count in all by themselves. Or single diseases, that's how we give them this international classification of disease code. Doctors get paid according to what they diagnose. By our thinking of health in terms of one thing at a time, in our little context like that, what it means is, okay, well, now we're going to find one thing to cure things. We make drugs with all their side effects. That becomes the primary means of health maintenance. So I'm going to suggest we're at the threshold now. We can be at the threshold now of actually transforming the entire healthcare system and think of it of a different way. Think about what we can do, and that's really about nutrition. There's countless, as I said. We have to think about nutrition. This is a real challenge to the way we do research and the way we think about things. Nutrition is not a one-on-one kind of thing. It's a collective thing. We call it holism, a holistic kind of idea. It's really, quite frankly, is anathema as far as the scientific community is concerned. That's at least my experience. But that's what nutrition is. Many diseases, working as a symphony. And interestingly, this is simple. It's very complex biology, but it's a simple solution. Just decide what we should put in our mouths. A whole food plant based diet, vegetables, fruits, grains, and legumes. Don't add back to oil, fat, and sugar. It's a lot cheaper. It really works. And as far as coming back to my initial thesis is concerned, we now have information, empirical data, to actually show that if you take a group of people, I've been involved in a couple of these tests now. If you take a group of people, give them the right food, the things that happen to us, whether we have a disease or not, are remarkable. You can see these things within a week or two. Cholesterols go down, body weight drops off, and I'm going to say that should be the future of medicine. Or let's say, I don't like the word medicine. Let's say it's the future of food and the future of our health. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Campbell. It was interesting talking to you. It's very hard to make some questions for him afterwards. So I think we'll just go over to our next speaker. Tetyana Kalchenko is an educated medical doctor, and she's working as a senior consultant, which is the medical term for an overlege in English in Oslo. She has established a network for healthcare workers called HEPLA, which means healthcare for plant-based diet. So our next talk is health efforts of plant-based food. The floor is yours. And there is a little timer here which tells you how much time there is.
Perfect, it's very good. Yeah. Hi, and thank you for the invitation. My name is Tetyana Kalchenko. I am a physician, and I will speak today about health advantages at plant-based diet. Yes, maybe here. Yeah. Meat causes cancer and harm health. It's a broad scientific consensus about it. Campbell's arguments are substantiated by the world's biggest referee panels, authorities, and biggest knowledge reviews, biggest knowledge summaries. Yes, meat causes cancer. Also, World Health Organization do agree. And the world's biggest cancer research institutions agree. Two diets with much less animal foods than Western diet can help to prevent and manage many common diseases. And three, meat is not a necessary food for good or even for good health. It's not necessary for health. Not meat nor any other animal products. A little bit summary, what I will speak about. I will speak about that animal foods are linked to or cause many diseases as cancer, angina, stroke, diabetes, and some other. A healthy plant-based diet can prevent and manage more diseases than a healthy animal-based traditional Western diet. We can have a healthy, nutritionally adequate diet without any animal products. And this diet is also beneficial for the environment. 2016 is International Year of Pulses. It's United Nations that said it, wanted it. And milk and meat promotion is politically driven, financed by the government. In accordance to Norwegian law, omsetningsloven. I don't know how it's to translate it in English, but it's a law that, I will speak later. And we should think about new, healthy and sustainable agriculture politics. I will refer to big scientific reviews, big knowledge summaries and institutions, organizations. It's World Health Organization, World Cancer Research Fund, International Agency for Research on Cancer, Harvard, Nordic Nutrition Recommendations and Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee from the USA. World Health Organization. It has a very big project, Global Burden of Disease. It's a collaboration between 500 researchers from 50 countries. And last year it was published a study in the Lancet that counted diseases and risk factors, and it was published last year. And based on this study, this is a publication, and based on this study, it was made another study which evaluated how dietary changes could influence health and lifespan, environment, and healthcare costs. And here is the picture. This study showed that vegan dietary pattern gives most benefits. The more plant-based, the better. If we see a picture, here are different. Can I show with? Okay, you see. Here are different benefits. It's in environment, it's healthcare, and value of life benefits. And here are three different dietary patterns. It's healthy guidelines from Western authorities. It's animal-based. This is vegetarian and this is vegan. And we see that vegan dietary pattern had the highest benefits, the most benefits, both for environment, for healthcare, and for value of life. It was. It shows that dietary changes that are beneficial for environment are also beneficial for human health, and the more plant-based diet, the better. Here is the publication, Marcus Springman, Oxford, this year. Yes. The same told Norwegian Nordic nutrition recommendations 3 years before. They told it's a big summary, a big scientific summary, Nordic nutrition recommendations from Nordic Council of Ministers, and it says that dietary patterns that are much more plant-based than Western type dietary pattern are associated with low risk of most chronic diseases. About meat and health, is there good enough documentation that meat causes cancer? Yes, it is good enough. Last year, it was World Health Organization that published a big scientific review, and they based on more than 800 studies, and they concluded that processed meat, both red and white, it was sufficient evidence that it was carcinogenic or caused cancer for humans. It was mostly colorectal cancer, and some positive association was also seen for stomach cancer. Lean red meat, or not lean, but unprocessed red meat was also, they said that it also probably was probably carcinogenic to humans. But here is a little bit weaker evidence, but still strong enough evidence. And it was also observed association mainly was association with colorectal or bowel cancer, but also pancreatic and prostate cancer. And what is red meat and processed meat? Red meat is meat which is unprocessed, meat from mammalian muscles, or it's mammalian muscles of animals, not birds, but animals. What is processed meat? Processed meat, it's all kind of meat that are transformed in one or other way. Salting, curing, fermentation, or other processes to enhance flavor or improve preservation. Yes, this year, world's biggest organization on cancer research concluded also with strong evidence that processed meat increase stomach cancer risk. To get benefits, we should not just eat a little bit less meat or choose lean meats. We should eat substantially less meat. Why? Because one of the reasons is in Norway, 50% of meat comes as processed meats. It's all kind of sausages, cold cuts, or meatballs and other. And many big organizations or institutions says that processed meat should be avoided at all. Yes, here are some quotes from World's Cancer Research Fund: avoid processed meat. International Agency for Research on Cancer says the same, and American Institute the same. Avoid cold cuts, bacon, and other. And the same Harvard says: avoid bacon, cold cuts, and other processed meats. Meat can cause also many other health problems. It's a quote from a big scientific review, and researchers say that neither unprocessed red nor processed meat are beneficial for health, and they suggest to choose other alternatives to meat. And the same, you can, of course, you can find much more results if you go to PubMed and search on meat, cardiovascular, diabetes, stroke, obesity, and again, Nordic nutritional recommendations say that there is strong evidence that high consumption of processed meat increases the risk of cancer, diabetes, obesity, and coronary heart disease. Similar but weak associations have been observed for red meat. Yes, another big scientific review. It's official governmental USA Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. They say that diet high in plant-based foods and low in animal-based foods is more health-promoting. Norwegian Nutrition Council said the same in 2011, that diet should be mainly plant-based. Here is a quote from this report. It is concern about if vegan diet is nutritionally adequate, if we can get enough nutrients. Yes, we can. It's one of many organizations that says that appropriately planned vegetarian diets, including total vegetarian or vegan diet, are healthful, nutritionally adequate, and appropriate for individuals during all stages of the life cycle. And it was the world's biggest organization for dietists and nutritionists. Yes, so it's a question from last century if vegan diet is nutritionally adequate. because it's a very broad consensus that it is adequate, yes. And vegan diet consists of legumes, as beans, peas, lentils, grains, vegetables, fruits and berries, nuts and seed, enriched plant milks, and vitamin B12. Yes, it's a lot of concern about nutrients, but vitamin B12 is the only vitamin that people cannot get with vegan diet. And neither meat nor milk are natural sources of vitamin B12, calcium or iodine, because all these vitamins and much more different vitamins are added to enhance the nutritional content of animal fodder. Yes, if we stop to eat meat, what should we eat instead of meat? It's legumes, it's beans, peas and lentils. Here are 6 kinds of Norwegian produced beans and peas. This year is United Nations Year of Pulses. It's because pulses can replace meat, they have many health benefits, they are climate friendly, and in Norway we can produce 4 times more legumes, peas and beans than we do it today. Which health benefits has vegan or vegetarian diets? It's a lot. Again, the world's biggest organization for dietists and nutritionists says that they are associated with low risk of death from ischemic heart disease, lower cholesterol levels, blood pressure, hypertension, diabetes, lower body mass index, and lower overall cancer rate. It's convincing evidence that vegetarians have lower rates of coronary heart disease. Yes, it's a quote. So yeah, it's a lot of summaries that says the same, that vegan or vegetarian diet can give many health benefits. USA's biggest health enterprise, Kaiser Permanente, encourage physicians to recommend vegan diet, plant-based diet to all their patients, especially those with high blood pressure, diabetes, cardiovascular or obesity. And especially vegan diet reduced diabetes 2 risk at Adventist Health Study 2. Here is odds ratio at non-vegetarians. If it's 1 compared to it, vegans have much less risk, just 0.4. Yes. Mediterranean diet is well-known healthy diet, but not everyone knows that Mediterranean diet is mainly plant-based diet. It's much less animal products and much more beans in Mediterranean diet than it is in Western diet. Yes, when we know that it's a lot of evidence that more plant-based, vegetarian, vegan, or much more plant-based diet is more health-promoting and more climate-friendly. But our health authorities said there's no panic. It's not so big risk to eat processed meat or meat at all. Its risk is much smaller than if you smoke. So it's not big risk. No, meat is very important to get enough nutrients. Here is article of Linda Grønlund, divisjonsdirektør at Norwegian Directorate of Health, about processed meats. Yes, she wrote that knowledge base does not justify recommending an avoidance as we do with tobacco products. But here are many conclusions. Yes, world's biggest referee panel shows, yes, it is dangerous. You should avoid processed meats. Cancer Research UK counted that almost 9,000 cancer cases, just bowel cancer cases per year, could be avoided if everybody should stop to eat red meat or processed meat. Question is why the government don't promote vegan or vegetarian diet. It's because one of the reasons is that dietary guidelines are based on modern dietary habits. But the problem is that these habits are influenced by political policy that promotes animal foods. It's a vicious circle. Rhetoric question. Maybe it's so that the same political policy that will promote milk and meat also influence official dietary guidelines. Maybe it's lobby from dairy and meat industry. Maybe they also can influence politics. We have in Norway a law or act, omsetningsloven, that have aims to promote sales of agricultural commodities, milk, meat and eggs through so-called information offices. You know, maybe opplysningskontorene. And they inform people that milk and meat are necessary to get enough nutrients and to have good health. It's not neutral information, it's influence, it's marketing. They don't inform that vegan diet is healthful and meat causes cancer. They don't say it. And it's used about 80 million Norwegian crowns per year to promote meat. Yes. And here is a quote. It's maybe a little bit wrong translation, but these offices will help people to experience milk as necessary in diet, and they will try that opinion leaders will also will be positive to milk and meat. And today everything is different today than in 1936. Everything is different. Then I don't think that we need this omsetningsloven. And we need a dietary guidelines office that is not dependent on economical or agricultural government policy. And it should be easier to follow a healthy diet, contributing to better health and more sustainable food production. Some ideas. We should change Marketing Act. We should liquidate marketing taxes on meat and milk. We should liquidate opplysningskontorene or information offices for meat and milk, and we should work to increase production of plant-based meals, and we should work on increased cultivation of peas and beans in Norway, and also quinoa, another plant. Yes, it was it was all I wanted to say. Thank you for
Thank you very much. While you guys might consider a question, I'll just wanted to ask you, to get people who is usually used to having a lot of meat in their diet get interested into eating more vegan food, what kind of menus or what is the most delicious food you can make from plants?
Yes, it comes. It's depend on if you want something that people know from before. It's vegan burger. It's very popular, and vegan lasagna, very popular. Falafel and hummus. But it's also very many recipes that are not so good known, that people don't know, but they are very delicious. It's saute vegetables. Saute. Yes, it's vegetables, not steak, ikke stekt, men not. It's not in damp, but it's wok. Yeah, it's something like kind of wok. Yeah, wok.
Yeah. We just came from Pygmalion, and the vegetarian lasagna was sold out, so there's no way to get that for tonight. But yes, it's interesting. Any questions? Yes?
Jeg spør på norsk. Insekter, det jo egentlig inn. Hvordan det med insekter i dietten? Det også samme som rødt kjøtt, eller det bare vegetarer?
I'll just translate. The question is, what about insects? How are they operating as an alternative to meat?
Yes, nobody knows about it. It's not any studies on it. So it's not big studies. So I don't think they are not necessary. Maybe they much better than red meat, maybe. But we could be healthy and get enough nutrients with plant-based food. So it's very well known that plant-based foods are healthy.
Thank you very much. There will be more opportunities to ask some more questions
Yeah.
after at the end of the session.
Thank you.
Now we'll have a little break, but after the break, Erik Tansmeyer will join us from Boston, and then afterwards, Arne Grønlund from NIBIO will also tell us about the possibilities to reduce emissions in agriculture. So we start again at 2025. So you can stretch a little bit, and we'll open up the door to get some fresh air for you all. Da bare begynner jeg å introdusere meg. Yeah. Welcome back, everybody, both here in Bergen and I hope you're back in Drammen also. Our next speaker, Erik Tonsmeyer, is an award-winning author of Paradise Lost and also the co-author of the Edible Forest Gardens. He's an appointed lecturer at the Yale University, and Erik has studied permaculture, which means permanent culture, and the useful plants of the world for over 2 decades. He has also been managing an urban farm project for 5 years. So he's not only talking about it, he's also doing it, which is sometimes very useful if you want to find out if things really works. He's now been publishing a book called Carbon Farming, and Erik is joining us from Boston, US. So if you can hear me, Erik, how is it going in Boston? Hello, Erik. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Hello.
Welcome to Bergen. I'm very glad you're traveling so environmentally friendly, saving greenhouse gases by just participating digitally.
We are. There are many trees we do not have to plant because I'm presenting in this way.
Thanks a lot. So welcome to Bergen, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Let's see. I've been asked to speak about carbon sequestration in agriculture, and this is really a perfect way to frame me to have on one side a presentation about changes in diet, and on the other side a presentation about reducing emissions in agriculture. So this is just the context where I would like to be. I'm told you can see my screen, so I will begin.
Yes.
Let's see. Just very briefly for context, I've been working on these kinds of agroforestry systems and perennial crops for about 25 years. And it was somewhere around 2009 that I began to take climate change seriously and began to understand that the systems I had been studying and practicing had an important role to play in climate change mitigation. So I've been working at that ever since. I recently had a book come out on the subject. And I teach at a university about it, and I also work with a group called Project Drawdown, modeling the economic and climate mitigation impact of 100 different solutions: land, buildings, energy, transportation, and so on. I work on the land-based solutions. So let's jump on ahead then. The first notion is that sometimes we hear carbon dioxide described as a pollutant in terms of climate change, and I like to think of it really as a natural product that's being misused and put in the wrong places. And our planet has 5 great pools of carbon: the ocean, the atmosphere, the fossil pools like the oil and coal underground, and then we have a pool in the soil, and a pool, what we call the biotic pool, which is plants and animals and leaf litter, things like that. And carbon has cycled naturally between these different pools since the origin of life on Earth. What has happened, however, is that we've been moving substantial carbon from the fossil pool to the atmospheric pool, and in the form of carbon dioxide there, causes significant warming. And we also have the issue that a great amount of carbon from the biotic pool and the soil pool has been moved to the atmospheric pool as well through clearing of land for agriculture and degradation of agricultural land. So we've been moving it around, and what we need to do at this point is to leave the remaining fossil carbon in the ground, to leave the remaining healthy forests intact, and begin to move as much carbon dioxide from the atmospheric pool back into soils and back into living biomass as much as we can, and also into products made from biomass like wooden buildings or long-lived bioplastics or textiles and things like that. So far, so good? I can see you all, so yes, that's great. I see some nodding, that's nice. And really what we need to do for climate change mitigation is two different pieces. The first is we have to dramatically reduce our level of emissions. And the second is we have to remove the excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and neither will work on their own. The reason that reducing emissions alone won't work is that we're already well past the safe line of 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide. We're over 400. So we've already passed a tipping point. We're already in an unsafe place. And much of the carbon dioxide we've emitted, we won't see its impact for another 3 decades. So we're already in a dangerous place. And we need to, so if we stopped all emissions today, we would already be in great danger of serious impacts from climate change. On the other hand, we can't only remove the excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere because there's a limit to how much can be stored in soils and biomass. And that limit is much less than the total amount of fossil fuels that remains. So we really have to do both together, and we have to do both very aggressively in order to return to safe levels of carbon dioxide. And we'll just assume for a moment that I'm also including talking about methane and nitrous oxide and some of these other kinds. We're looking at carbon dioxide equivalents. And there's really 4 main things we want to do in the realm of agriculture. This reattaining 350 parts per million. The IPCC says it requires transformative pathways. It requires transforming all of the different aspects of our civilization. So here's what that looks like in agriculture. First, we need to reduce emissions from agriculture, and I believe our next presentation is about that. Second, we need to sequester carbon through agriculture, which we'll be talking about. Third is we need to produce more food on the land we have. The reason for this being that almost half of the emissions from agriculture are from clearing land for more farming, cutting down forests. So if we can grow more on the land we have, then we don't need to do that. It certainly contributes to not needing to clear further forest. And many of the practices we're talking about today do so in an agroecologically friendly way, growing more food on the land we have, rather than by using huge amounts of additional fertilizers and pesticides, doing it through more ecological approaches. And finally, we need to adapt to the new world that is being created. We need to learn to farm in a world where rainfall often comes more in the form of heavy storms followed by droughts than perhaps the rainfall we're used to, and so on. And these are sort of coupled with changes in diet, reduction of food waste. Globally, we waste about 30% of food. So if we could just tighten that up a little bit, it would greatly ease the pressure on the world's farmland and on deforestation as well. And finally, this goes along also with the restoration of salt marshes and mangroves and forests and other kinds of ecosystems that really have generally have a much more powerful carbon impact than even the best agricultural practices. The highest and best use of almost any piece of land in terms of carbon is likely reforestation and restoration. Excuse me. Okay, so carbon farming then we'll define as a suite of practices, a group of practices, and I have about 40 general categories in the book that sequester carbon, that remove atmospheric carbon. In some people's definition, you must be paid for performing that service for it to be carbon farming. I feel more agnostic about that, but I'm certain that it won't be possible at the scale that is necessary without financial incentives for farmers to adopt these practices. Some of these practices are ready to go and are already being practiced on millions of hectares around the world, whereas others are new and under development, still being worked out. And they can be for very large-scale mechanized operations or for very small smallholder operations. Really, everywhere that can be farmed in the world, every farmable climate has at least one kind of carbon farming which is appropriate for it. Excuse me. So if you could think back to high school biology for a moment, I know it can be difficult to remember for some of us. Photosynthesis is the practice where, among other things, plants take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They break the carbon off and return the oxygen to the atmosphere. And the carbon becomes sugar. It's made into glucose in the tissues of the plant. And then often that is it's made into starches for storage. It's made into sugars for more immediate use. It's made into cellulose. Cellulose, for example, like fibers, like cotton fibers, are just made of long chains of glucose, which is a product of photosynthesis. And within an hour, much of that sugar is exuded through the roots to feed organisms in the soil. So some of it ends up in the soil right away. Some of that ends up being off-gassed again, but some of it ends up in there in the long term right away. And over time, as the leaves and roots decompose, they become organic matter in the soil. And biomass, plant biomass, if you were to dry it out, is about 50% carbon. And organic matter, soil organic matter, is about 57 or 58% carbon, again, on a dry weight basis. So that's how the process of sequestration works, is through photosynthesis and the regular soil building process. Okay, we're going to look at a few examples of broad categories of practices and then some particular ones that are suitable for practicing in Norway. The first is better ways to grow the annual crops that we know and love. Things like soybeans and wheat and barley and potatoes and things like that. Excuse me. One concept that's important is the annual rate of sequestration. That is how much carbon is sequestered in a year, and that's usually measured in metric tons per hectare per year. And not all practices sequester equally. So we have conservation agriculture, organic agriculture. These are better ways to raise annual crops. And they tend to sequester about 0.5 ton per hectare per year, on average, maybe up to 1 ton in a good year. Whereas when you begin to integrate trees in an annual cropping system, you can often see a 10-fold increase in the amount of carbon that is sequestered. It's not that it's bad to farm organically or bad to use conservation agriculture, but it's good to know that we have practices that have much greater rates of carbon sequestration. This is contrasted with our conventional practices for raising annual crops, which actually are net emitters of carbon. So even a small rate of sequestration is much better than emissions. But certainly wherever possible, we should aim for the most powerful sequestration we can. And these various strategies for intercropping trees are the best.
Slide?
Oh no, I'm sorry. Are they not jumping ahead? We're on the 4th or 5th one now. Let's see.
Yeah, because we still see the first one.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. You know what? I sent them to you. Well,
Yeah,
why don't we try?
now it changed.
It did. Okay.
Now we
okay.
have this. Now we
I'll
have
just
1,
keep it
2, 3,
this.
4, 5. This is number 5 now.
I'll bring them back so you can see. This is the one about the carbon pools and how they move around. Let's see. This is the 4-point program. This is the definition of carbon farming. This one is sequestration. And then this is annual cropping. So you now see it. Does that show again? No, I guess I can blow them. Oh, I'm not sure I know how to do that. Let's see if I can, let's see if this works. How's that look? luck. You know, we may just look at them like this.
Yeah,
Is it
yeah,
visible
that's
enough?
okay.
Okay. Well, we'll just do our best, and I could email you this, and you could share it with the part. Oh, you already have it, so you could share it with the participants
Yeah,
if you like.
marvelous.
So they.
This is good.
Great. Okay. It's also worth noting that the total amount of carbon stored in the soil in a tree intercropping agroforestry system is much higher, 150 tons maximum versus about 20 tons maximum. And both of these are very widely practiced around the world. So here are a few sample practices from Norway. Did it just switch to show some practices for Norway? Oh, good. Okay. Well, so there's a bunch. I won't go through all of them, but a number of these practices are already practiced on a wide scale around the cold regions of the world, and then we have some others that are really currently only ready for, let's say, highly innovative farmers who are interested in trying new and experimental things, who are interested in taking a risk. So a number of these are better practices for annual cropping, cover crops, crop rotation, reducing tillage, intercropping with trees, and so on. So then we have some practices for livestock. The first one is better ways of grazing, and the potential of that has really been oversold, I think, by certain folks. But it is true that there are ways of improving grazing practice that sequester very modest amounts of carbon, again, about 0.5 ton per hectare per year. But where it is possible, where there's sufficient water to enable the interplanting of trees in those pastures, again, we see a 10-fold increase in carbon sequestration rates, and about a 5-fold increase in the total storage in soil over the life of that system. So that's quite impressive to me. And for Norway, we would have a better grazing, silvopasture, which is trees and pastures, and then the practice of reintegrating crops and livestock, which has some mild sequestration impacts. For example, using manure on fields instead of putting manure into a manure lagoon or something like that. But also has very powerful climate change adaptation impacts. And then there's a bunch of other things that would be very interesting to try and are not yet ready for broad-scale commercial implementation. And let's just talk for a moment about the controversy around livestock and climate. It's probably the most controversial issue. I will tell you that it's clearly scientifically shown that there are some livestock production practices that have net carbon sequestration, even when the emissions of methane and nitrous oxide from the animals, let's say cows, are included. Those are certainly not the majority of livestock production in the world today, which is a very serious contributor to emissions. But it's not that there are not ways to raise livestock. A third of our annual cropping land in the world is used to provide food for livestock, which is really not a terribly sustainable notion. Very briefly, my proposal is that we should stop feeding food to livestock that's suitable for humans, but we should feed food that's suitable for humans to people. The livestock we do raise should be raised with some of these carbon-friendly practices, or they might be fed perennial foods like hay, or fed food waste, which is a nice way to turn food waste into something productive. And that livestock should be raised either integrated with crops or raised on land where you cannot grow annuals because it's too cold or too dry or too rocky or too steep or too remote. And I suspect for most of Europe, certainly for the US and Canada, that means quite a bit less meat and livestock products in the diet of most people, in terms of, if this is the ideal livestock production scenario, in terms of climate, then that's likely to be reflected in diets with a more plant-based diet for most people. And we could talk about that more in the questions. There's lots and lots to say about that, and much has been said on all sides of that argument. Often very strong opinions, not entirely backed by facts. But what's really encouraging, and probably you heard this morning, is that a healthy diet is actually a diet that's good for the climate, which is really fantastic. So our next category is perennial crops, trees or herbaceous perennials that provide crops, and like fruit trees, let's say, for example, ideally we would like to see staple crops that produce protein and carbohydrates and fats for basic human consumption that grow on trees, to really have the power of sort of like edible reforestation with an excellent carbon impact. What I can tell you is that in the tropics, we're ready to do that, but in cold climates, we don't yet really have staple crops that grow on trees or other perennial forms that are competitive in terms of yields with our annual staples. But these fully perennial systems have much higher rates of carbon sequestration than other ways of growing plant-based food. And there's a number that are ready in Norway. For example, Scandinavia really leads the world in short rotation coppice systems, producing willows for biomass energy, for example. There certainly are small scale things ready to do in terms of more complex agroforestry systems. There's plenty of fruits that grow nicely, and the sea buckthorn actually is an oil crop. It's sort of the avocado of the north, and I would love to see it developed to begin to replace crops like rapeseed, annual crops like rapeseed that we use for oil. And then we have a number of things which may soon be ready for more commercial production. The one that's most interesting to me at the moment is leaf protein concentrate, which is a kind of tofu or cheese that's made from leaves. It can be made from grasses, from brassicas, from the leaves of poplars, and all kinds of other things. I'm fairly certain that it is the absolute best in terms of climate change mitigation. It's absolutely the most climate friendly thing we could eat. It's also the worst tasting thing of all food options that we can have. Much like you wouldn't eat raw tofu, you wouldn't really want to eat raw leaf protein concentrate, but it's something that we could see blended into other foods and also fed to livestock instead of soybeans. So I think we're going to be seeing more and more of that in the future. The IPCC is excited about it as a feed for livestock, for example. Then we have a few other tools in our toolkit, which would include certain kinds of infrastructure on the farm, amendments, which would be things like fertilizers or something you might add or mix in, and some productive ecosystem management strategies. So practices in Norway would be reforestation with useful native plants. Why not reforest with the edible and medicinal species so that you can have reforestation and have some use for people as well? Use of biochar, which is a sort of a fancy kind of charcoal, which has its own set of controversies. Excuse me, in the use of terraces. These are practices that are ready. And then there's a number of other interesting ones. You're not really a region that's short on rainfall. You're not a place where rainwater harvesting is really critical, although that could change. So what do we see? What could possibly go wrong? Many things could go wrong. First, we have the risk of, we see, for example, in the large scale planting of oil palm, that a good idea can be done in a really bad way and have terrible impacts on people and the environment. Some of these products, some of these practices take time to work. For a farmer to switch to one of these practices typically takes 2 to 5 years before they begin to make good money on it. So there's a risk for farmers, and it takes time for them to implement it. We need to assist farmers to make that transition. Let's see, I'll skip a few of these that are less relevant where you are. Well, there's a danger, I think, that we can become complacent and think that agriculture will do the job, that it will soak up all of our emissions and we can keep on going burning all the fossil fuels we want. And that's really not true, because there's a limit to how much we can store in soils and biomass. Some of the perennial crops that are most promising and productive have potential as invasive species, and some of these things are still not ready yet. For example, people are working on perennial versions of wheat and barley and maize and other kinds of crops, and someday we will have those, but we don't have them yet. So we can't yet switch to something that doesn't really exist yet. It's going to take time for us to be able to make that transition. When we look at the total overall impact of these practices, there's been many estimates. A recent one that I really like, from a paper that I really like, says that if we applied the most basic improved annual cropping practices, around 0.5 ton per hectare per year of sequestration, to all of the world's cropland, that would give us about 40 of the 50 parts per million that we need to reduce currently. There's a number. Okay, that sounds great. Oh, and it's spelled wrong. That has a number of potential benefits. Here's the problem. We're not going to be able to access all of the world's farmland. Many farmers are very stubborn. Having farmed myself, I know this very well. So we're not going to get all the farmers. Many regions that are torn with conflict, like Syria or Sudan, we're not going to be able to get in and have programs to reach farmers. And meanwhile, we continue with emissions. So by the time we're done, we're going to need to sequester, we're going to need to remove 100 parts per million and not 50. But this shows what cropland could do, given that we also can increase some of this by quite a bit by incorporating trees. And we also have grazing land and forestry in our toolkit. There is an impressive, modest contribution that carbon farming can play, which is to say, when it's combined with very aggressive efforts to reduce emissions, it gives us an actual shot of reaching 350 parts per million if we really work to transform all aspects of civilization, which really we needed to do for a long time anyway. Let's face it, civilization has needed a bit of an overhaul. If you're interested in learning more, my website here is carbonfarmingsolution.com. And I have a number of resources there for people to use. There's lists of species broken down by climate. There's videos about a number of practices. There's excerpts of the book. And then a bunch of my favorite readings are posted on there as well. So that can give you a place to turn to learn more. Or, of course, you can get your hands on my book. I think right now you would have to get it through Green Books in England. I don't think we have a distributor in Scandinavia at the moment. And I think we might do a few questions.
Yes, thanks a lot for, we'll give you a little applause first.
Oh, thank you. That was a very brief, overview of a 500-page book. So it didn't include all the details.
Thanks a lot. Who wants to ask the first question? Or maybe you want to think about while I ask the first? Okay. Just tell me, Eric, what kind of political changes do you think is needed to get through Parliament in order to get carbon farming done in a good way, not in the bad way, where
Sure.
it's kind of overtaken? Just leave it. Yeah.
Sure. Well, one thing is a number of countries already have a mechanism in place for what we call payment for environmental services, where farmers are paid to implement conservation practices, whether it's installing or maintaining hedgerows or improving water quality, things like that. So we can use mechanisms like that to pay farmers to implement carbon farming practices. I'm not generally in favor of carbon offset trading. unless there's a rapidly shrinking cap, which there usually is not. But I do like the notion of governments paying farmers to do this. I'm certainly open to carbon trading if it would actually include a reduced, shrinking cap, meaning less and less carbon emitted every year. I also am very encouraged. There's a new a project emerging out of France called the 4 for 1,000 initiative, where governments and NGOs are signing on to commit to try to raise the organic matter in their soil in their country by 0.4% every year. And it looks as though that is the first real international coalition of governments who are trying to get involved in soil sequestration. And I don't know if the Norwegian government is currently a participant in that, but that would be something that would be useful to lobby for.
Thank you. The point then is maybe to make sure that that not carbon farming is used as a reason to continue the oil activity in Norway, which I guess our previous prime minister would be really fighting for if he would be still in power. Now he's in charge of guns instead in NATO, so we'll just hope he doesn't make that into a carbon trade scheme. But I'll give the word to Arne, which has a question about ecological farming. And also, we discussed this at the dinner. Do you want to ask Eric about the emissions from?
Yes. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Yes. You mentioned that carbon loss from vegetation and soil is the biggest contribution of greenhouse gases from agriculture.
Oh, I can't quite hear. It's breaking up a little bit. Could you repeat the question?
Just a bit closer there.
Yes, you hear me now?
Yes, much better.
You mentioned in your presentation that carbon loss from vegetation and soil is the biggest contribution of greenhouse gases from agriculture.
Historically speaking, over the last 10,000 years, yes.
Yes. Are you,
and even today, about half is from deforestation for new agricultural land. About 90% of deforestation is for farming. So
yes.
that is the biggest contribution.
But
yes.
What is your opinion about organic farming, which has significant lower yield and will require more land for cultivation?
Yes. Well, that's a really excellent question. In cold climates, organic farming yields less than conventional. The reverse is true in the...
Say that again.
Oh, sure. In cold climates, organic farming yields less food per hectare per year than conventional, whereas the reverse of that is true in the tropics. Organic yields better in the tropics. If everyone, there's been a number of interesting studies looking at this recently, actually. If everyone switched to organic farming and stayed at the scale they are now, and diet stayed the same it was, and food waste stayed the same it was, that might require additional deforestation. So wide scale, I love organic, it's great, but this is true. So wide scale adoption of organic, wide scale conversion to organic, it would have good sequestration on the farm. That would be offset by avoided deforestation. So it would need to come with things like diet change, reduction in food waste, or smaller farms. Because when larger farms are compared to smaller farms always produce more. So if you broke up a 1,000-hectare farm into a number of smaller farms, each of which was producing organically, they could produce as much per hectare as a larger farm in some circumstances. This is a larger conventional farm. So there are issues of scale of the size of the farm are also important. Smaller farms, whether they're organic or not, produce more because they're more intensive. There's more, we say the eyes to hectares ratio is better. So there are contexts in which organic farming would work. Also, a number of the agroforestry practices increase production of annual crops, and it may well be that those, when combined with organic farming, can end up, rather than giving you an increase over conventional, might at least allow you to equal conventional. There's a lot of experimentation that would need to be figured out to determine the right mix of practices for any given country. Yeah, that's sort of a roundabout way of answering. How's that? Was that satisfying?
Yes, but you cannot compare the conventional agriculture, the high input conventional agriculture in our part in the world with the low input conventional part agriculture in the tropics.
That's correct.
Yes.
Yes, that's why organic does better in the tropics. Its competition is not as intense.
So the message is that we need to travel further south, or are there other possibilities for the northerners?
The message is that it's complicated, that sequestration needs to be balanced against intensification, needs to be balanced against adaptation, and diet change and food waste reduction and the size of farms are all pieces of the mix that each region sort of needs to determine as part of its policy basis. It's really, there isn't really a simple one solution for any of these things.
So in a way, what you're describing is maybe that Norway should continue our small farm business instead of joining into bigger farms, which is mainly the main focus of the present government.
Well, I would want to look at some data about production and so on. I would want to look at a bunch of numbers, but I would say that you could definitely make an argument for that, yes.
Interesting. Thanks a lot. Are there any other questions for Eric before we say goodbye to Boston? No? Thanks a lot, Eric, for a very good talk and some good answers. So have a good time over there, and I hope to see more of you in the future.
Great. Thank you all very much. Have a wonderful evening.
That was a good experience on Skype this time, so we have to give them some good feedback on that. So there we are. Yes, and then we already got to know Arne Grønlund, which is a senior researcher at NIBIO. His expert area is soil quality, resources and soil development, soil classification, soil mapping, soil databases, and precision farming. He's been working with carbon transformation and greenhouse gas emissions from soil and impact of climate change on Arctic terrestrial environments. So I think this is it'll be a very interesting focus now on what we can do here further north when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions and mitigations in Norwegian agriculture. So the floor is yours, Arne.
Thank you. Det første bildet.
Ja. De her piltastene.
Ja. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to this interesting meeting. I will give a presentation about greenhouse gas emissions and mitigation options in Norwegian agriculture. And I will start with a calculation of greenhouse gas emission from Norway. The total emission is calculated to about 54 million tons CO2 equivalents. The emission from agriculture is calculated to 4.4 million tons CO2 equivalent. When carbon loss from soil and organic soil are not included in the calculation. If CO2 loss from soil is included, then the agricultural emission is about 6 million tons CO2 equivalents, or about 11% of the total Norwegian emission. So, to the sources for emission from agriculture. Enteric fermentation is the biggest source. It contributes to about 30% of the emissions. Manure contributes to about 15%, and manure lead to emissions of methane and nitrous oxide. Peat cultivation contributes to about 28%. Most of these emissions are CO2, but also a significant emissions from nitrous oxide. Mineral fertilizers, about 9%. Fossil combustion, about 7%, and other sources, about 11%. So you can see that 3 sources, enteric fermentation, manure, and peat cultivation, contribute with nearly 75% of the total emissions. So to differences between food products. We compare meat, egg, milk and dairy products, and vegetarian food. Meat contributes to 60% of the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. Milk contributes to 35%, egg 2%, and vegetarian food only 3%. We can compare with the percent of energy production in food in the agriculture. Meat contributes to 27% of the food, of the energy food. Milk 44%, egg 4%, and vegetarian food 25%. So to the differences between meat, between different meat products. And I will compare 5 productions, meat productions. The first is beef cattle. The second is dairy cattle, so meat from dairy cattle. Sheep, poultry, and pigs. Beef cattle contribute with 14% of the emission and only 1% of the energy production in food. Meat from dairy cattle contributes to 21% of the emissions and 4% of the energy production. Sheep, 15% of the emissions and 2% of the energy. Pigs, 7% of the emission and 14% of the energy production. And at last, poultry, 2% of the emission and 6% of the production. We can also compare the emissions per kilogram meat. We can see here that beef cattle have an emission of about 30 kilo CO2 equivalents per kilo meat. Meat from dairy cattle, 15 kilogram CO2 equivalents, the half of the emissions from beef cattle. Sheep, about 28 kilogram CO2 equivalents. And pigs, 2.4, and at last poultry, 1 kilogram CO2 per kilo meat. From this we can put the meat in 2 classes. the high emissions classes, beef cattle, dairy cattle and sheep, the ruminants, that's the high emission. And the low emission is the light meat, pigs and poultry. There's very, very large differences between these two groups. So, an interesting question. Why are the differences so large? We can see that meat from ruminants have 10 to 30 times higher emissions than meats from pigs and poultry. There are several reasons for this. Ruminants produce methane when digestion of grass. About 6% of the carbon in the grass are converted to methane. And pigs and poultry produce more piglets and more eggs. That means less emissions from the adult sows and the mother hens. They utilize feedstuff much better. They produce less manure. The consequence is less emissions of methane and nitrous oxide from manure. But what's the reason for the differences between ruminants? We can compare the three ruminants: dairy cattle, beef cattle, and sheep. A dairy cattle produce 7,500 liter milk per year, in addition to a calf. The emissions from the dairy cow are allocated to the milk production, and only emissions from the growth of the calves are allocated to meat production. For beef, cattle and sheep, all emissions are allocated to meat production. But sheep got normally 2 lambs per year, while a cow only got 1 calf. So, to the meat consumption in Norway. We consume about 75 kilo meat per person in Norway. 20 kilo cattle meat, 30 kilo pig meat, 20 kilo poultry meat, and 5 kilo sheep meat. Of the cattle meat, about 12 kilo is from the dairy cattle, meat from dairy cattle, and 8 kilo from beef cattle. Of the meat from the beef cattle, about 4 kilo per person is produced in Norway, and 4 kilo is imported from other countries. So now we have a base for a discussion about mitigation option. I will mention 4 options in my presentation. 2 options include shifting diets from red to light meat and from red meat to vegetarian and seafood. Reduced food waste. Production of biogas or manure, and no cultivation of pristine peatland. We start with the shifting of diets. We remember that of the 20 kilo consumption of cattle meat, 12 kilo from dairy cattle and 8 from beef cattle. The meat production from dairy cattle are limited by the milk consumption and milk production. If we consume less milk, we need less dairy cows and less calves from dairy cows and less meat from dairy cows. Beef production, meat from beef cattle is produced to meet the consumer's demand for cattle meat, for beef meat. If we reduced the consumption by 8 kilograms, what is the effect of the greenhouse gas emission? Of course, we will then abolish the beef cattle production because this production is the less profitable. If we replace 8 kilo beef meat with light meat, the reduction is about 12 to 13% of the greenhouse gas emission from agriculture. If we replace it by vegetarian food and seafood, the reduction is about 14% of the total emission from agriculture. So to reduce food waste. Food waste represents unnecessary production and unnecessary greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. On average, we waste about 46 kilogram food per person in Norway. If we reduced this by 50%, the reduction is estimated to about 1.6% of the greenhouse gas from agriculture. A significant reduction, but the reduction is about only 1/10 of the reduction of shifting diets. So to biogas of manure. The effects include reduced emissions from manure storage and reduced combustion of fossil fuel if the biogas is used in vehicles as fuel. If so much as 75% of the available manure are converted to biogas, the estimated reduction emissions from manure storage is about 4.3% of the total emission from agriculture. In addition, we will have an effect of reduced combustion of fossil fuel, estimated to about 2.7%. In total, about 7% reduction of the Norwegian agriculture emissions. A significant reduction, but still only half, about 50% of the effect of shifting diets. And then we talk about a moderate shift, only 8 kilogram meat per year and person. No cultivation of pristine peatland is a very important option, because cultivated peatland is a very, very significant source for greenhouse gases. In according to the IPCC standards, the emissions is about 20 kilogram nitrous oxides per hectare, which is equal to about 6 tons CO2 equivalents. In addition, the CO2 emissions is much higher, 29 ton CO2 per hectare. In total, 35 tons CO2 equivalents per hectare. The future effect of stop of cultivation can be calculated as 35 tons CO2 multiplied with the area which will be cultivated with no restriction. We can present an example. If the cultivation without restriction had been 500 hectares annually, you can see from this figure that after 20 years, the reduced emissions is about 6% of the agriculture emissions. So, mitigation options relevant for Hordaland County. Shifting diets and reduced food waste is relevant for all counties in Norway, for all people in Norway. Biogas on menu is also relevant. Hordaland County represents about 4% of the total potential of biogas from menu in Norway. And no cultivation of pristine peatland is also very relevant for Hordaland because peatland constitutes more than 50% of the potential agricultural land in Hordaland. So if cultivation of new land, you should be very, very aware of peatland, and you should prefer mineral soil for cultivation. So to the carbon sequestration in Norway. That was the topic of the last presentation. In Norway, we have a high content of carbon in soil. The reasons for that are cold and humid climate, a high portion of grassland, and a high portion of organic soil, which contain about 5 times more carbon compared with mineral soil per area unit. The main challenge in Norway is to avoid carbon loss from soil. And the most important option is to stop cultivation of pristine peatlands. And in addition, restoration of abundant cultivated peatland. The most effective way to increase carbon sequestration in mineral soil is conversion from arable cultivation to permanent grass. But this will lead to less food production because grass can only be consumed by ruminants. It will lead to more greenhouse gases because of the methane from ruminants. And in Hordaland, grassland constitute about 98% of the agricultural land. Then most of the remaining 2% is fruit land. Hordaland is a fruit county in Norway. And only small areas are used for potatoes and vegetables. But there is one effective way for carbon sequestration in Norway, and that is forest biomass and products from forest. biomass. Tree woods. I will also mention biochar, which is a conversion of biomass to stable carbon in char products. And the most relevant raw materials are straw from grains and forest waste. And if we select forest waste, there are no conflict to living trees. Biochar can be used as soil amendments for improving water and nutrient holding capacity of soil. But the limitation is the technology and cost for large-scale production. So, to my conclusion. Shifting diets is the most effective option to reduce greenhouse gas emission from agriculture. From red to light meat, or from red meat to vegetarian and seafood. And this will also lead to better health. So, thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much. I think we'll go straight for questions and answers. So maybe you could also come up to the floor. Who would like to ask the first question? Anyone? No. Then you.
Yeah.
Just say your name first.
Okay. Hello, my name is Mariken Vatne. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I just want to know if you could reflect a bit more, because you're talking about the shift from both from red meat to poultry and pork as being close to as good as shifting to a vegetarian diet, only 1% difference. But then again, those kinds of meats cannot be produced in a large extent in Norway, as we have, you said, a lot of grasslands, but not that much agricultural lands. Oh. So then again, we would have to import quite a bit. So wouldn't that mess up like the carbon calculations?
Yes. We believe that ruminants eat only grass, and they can eat only grass. But in the practice, in Norwegian agriculture, they eat as much concentrated feed as pork. About 4 kilo concentrated feed per kilogram meats from a cattle. For sheep production, about 2 kilogram. And this is necessary to get lamb with high weight in the stock, enough milk for the lamb in the spring. But it is not true that ruminants only eat grass.
But they can.
They can, but it is not profitable in Norway. A Norwegian who only produce meat from grass is bankrupt.
Do you want to answer, or shall we go to the next?
But that's like a political question. How whether it's profitable or not would be a political question. So what, like my point was that in Norway we have a lot of resources that only cattle can use to produce meat.
Well, we have lots of resources in the few summer months, but not in the winter. 70% of the feedstuff for ruminants should be harvested. In Argentina, all the grass is taken up on the pasture. That's the difference.
Next question.
Yeah, my name is Sunne. Thank you for two very interesting lectures. I have one question for each of you. Tetyana, you were talking about meat and vegetables a lot, but I was wondering, what about, I don't think you mentioned chicken, did you?
No, chicken. No, I mentioned chicken, but the processed meat, chicken can also be processed and should be avoided.
Okay.
All chicken that is processed, or it means cold cuts, meatballs, farce, and it's processed meat, then should be avoided.
Okay, and also I was wondering about eggs. Is eggs also bad?
Oh, eggs is not so dangerous as meat, not at all. But egg contains cholesterol, and people that have risk factors to develop, or that have already diabetes or heart problems, they should limit consume of eggs. But it's not so dangerous as meat. No, not at all.
Okay,
No.
thank you. And Arne, I was wondering about these numbers you had about the emissions of each of the meat sources. Were they based on diet? Were they based, or were they assumed that these animals only eat grass, or did they also take into account the emissions from transport of concentrated feed, for example, and cutting rainforests in Brazil, for example, for producing this food?
No, transport, rainforest is not included. Neither not emission from Norwegian peatland.
So do you have any idea how it would affect the numbers?
I think that the level of emission will be higher, but the difference the same.
Thank you.
There was one question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Anna Milford. I have a question concerning the. So it's related to the first question. When you showed the slide, on the slide the emissions from the different types of meat and per kilo, you didn't show at the same time the emission per kilo of different vegetables. Which, I mean, there's a wide range of vegetables, so it's kind of difficult. But you could have, if you'd shown, for instance, the emission per kilo of pulses, you would have had something. You would have, I mean, it would have been easier to see how much lower those are also compared to poultry and pig. So my question is, if you so therefore but you don't. But since the difference between white meat and red meat is so big, you don't get a very big difference when you switch from red meat to white meat compared to when you switch from red meat to vegetables. But if you did switch to vegetable or plant-based food instead compared to red meat, you would then avoid this question that was raised about the feed, and you would have wouldn't that lead to less more land being available for food production, and also therefore less pressure on, for instance, peat cultivation, because you would have sort of more more food. There would be just basically more food because we didn't give the food to the animals. We would just eat it ourselves.
I agree. We could have a third-class vegetarian. It is very difficult to calculate emissions per kilo because of the very large differences in water content. But we could relate the emission to the energy. And then almost all vegetarian food have much lower emissions. it could be some expansion from greenhouse gas produced food because of the energy consumption, but that is an exception. But it is true, vegetarian food requires much lesser area, smaller area to produce the food we need. Because when the feedstuff is consumed by animals, ruminants or pigs, most of the energy in the food is lost in the digestion in the livestock. So the most effective way to produce food and to eat food is to eat vegetarian food.
It's very nice to hear that from somebody else working closely with the agricultural business. So very, very interesting. I was just wondering if we should, Borgar, could you say some words about the work with the vision for future healthy and sustainable agriculture?
Yes. Well, a while back, a group of volunteers in the local chapter of Friends of the Earth, Naturvernforbundet, developed a vision called Gode grønne Bergen, Good Green Bergen, which focused mostly on transportation and infrastructure related to transport. And we're now working on developing, well, briefly about that previous document that was prepared. It was used in the byrådsforhandlinger, in the local municipal negotiations, and went directly into the platform of the local municipality. And we're now looking into developing a new tool in a similar vein, only much broader in its perspective. So looking at biodiversity in general, and there's a small team of volunteers working on that at the moment, and we're also looking to include these issues, so carbon capture and so health and climate related issues concerning plant-based diets or an animal-based diet. And tomorrow at 7, some of you may have gotten this invite already as you filled out the form to join this meeting and said that you would like to participate in the work towards developing such a vision. So tomorrow at 7 there's a meeting at Bryggen for everyone who's interested in contributing to this work in the coming months. And in specific terms, we will be collecting literature, reading up on the topic, and developing certain concrete action points, so do's and don't do's, focusing on the positive efforts that we may do in Hordaland to further a climate and body-friendly diet. So and we also have so we have about 60 volunteers, as I mentioned in the introduction, and they meet regularly to work on these issues. So if any of you are interested in joining, tomorrow at 7 is one way of doing it. And information on where to find us I have sent on email, but if you're wondering, it's at Bryggen, and the big golden unicorn, if you know where that is on Bryggen, you will easily spot it. You could just walk up the stairs underneath the unicorn. And another way is going online and finding Naturvernforbundet Hordaland on Facebook, and you will find directions there. So the address is there. And there are also many other opportunities of becoming involved in climate and environmental issues in Bergen through Friends of the Earth Hordaland. So yeah, that was what you were asking. So that's the
and this will also be presented towards the election next year when there's a national election, because a lot of the things we are finding out in this vision, we want to get politicians to get on board. So I think maybe we should just go over to the next part, which is just turning around the tables and talking to each other, having a drink if people want that. And do we have some more books? Yeah. And I also like to just give a big thanks to both of you for joining us in virtual position instead of only going online. We have two books here. One called Nature Never Lets You Down, which was made in the 100th anniversary of Naturvernforbundet. And we also have another one, which is På lag med naturen, which means on the side of nature for 100 years, which is the county book for our 100th anniversary. So you can decide which one you want, and then we have more books also. So I'll let you choose. And I also like to give this one for Christian as a thank for supporting this meeting, and also with some stories about what's been happening here the last 100 years. So thank you very much, all of you, and don't hesitate to stay in contact. This is a very important matter, and I think it really, in a way, connects together the solutions that we need in order to move forward in these questions. And Nature Conservation Society really wants to promote that change. So thanks for helping us in that direction.